Well, as Sarah said, over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at gifting and calling, and starting with Moses for the next 4 weeks. Moses' name is written large throughout the second 4 books of the Bible: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You can't escape from him. The greatest leader of the Israelites, who confronted Pharaoh, rescued the people from Egypt, received the 10 Commandments, talked with God, and gave them the law. But it doesn't seem to have gone off to a very good start, does it, in today's reading from Exodus chapter 2. But let's remind ourselves, let's turn back in time for a moment and see how it started. The Hebrew people had moved to Egypt during a time of famine with Joseph, when he'd risen to a position of power and wisely governed the provision of food. They prospered and become numerous, so numerous that the Egyptian rulers forgot the past history and felt threatened by this large number of immigrants. I wonder if that sounds familiar. So they enslaved them to work on their building projects. For 400 years, Pharaoh had commanded the murder 400 years, they'd worked on their building projects as slaves. Pharaoh then commanded the murder of all newborn boys. Yet the child Moses had survived. His mother hid him for 3 months and then put him in a basket and floated it on the river, where it was seen by Pharaoh's daughter, who, maybe understandably, was besotted by the young baby and accepted the offer from the child's sister, Miriam, to look after him for a while, maybe 3 or 4 years, before he was taken into Pharaoh's household and given an Egyptian name, Moses. And he was educated there, the best education that could have been available. Not just academic learning, but sport and literature and leadership, you name it, he got it, everything. And you can read more about this in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen was speaking to the Sanhedrin. He says, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in all his words and deeds. And again, we read about Moses in Hebrews chapter 11, when the writer is talking about all the heroes of faith. Some ancient historians have even suggested that Moses was being prepared to become the next Pharaoh. And that's where we are at the start of today's reading. Although he'd been raised as an Egyptian, Moses was very aware of his Jewish background. The texts don't say how that would be, but maybe this was instilled into him in those first few years by his mother and sister. What does that say about the importance of talking about God, about Jesus, even to young children? Maybe Pharaoh's daughter had actually told him of his background. We just don't know. But we know that he's strongly identified with the Hebrews, who he calls his people. He's now aged 40. And on this day, he went out to his people, and he saw an Egyptian beating one of his own people. And he was enraged. He was filled with righteous anger. And whether he intended to or not, he murdered the Egyptian. Moses acted on impulse, like a bull in a china shop. He somehow had the right motivation. He was seeking justice, but he clearly went about it in the wrong way. Now let's remember, at this point, we know that Moses had been appointed by God to lead the Hebrews from slavery as part of God's big plan. But these verses in Exodus don't say whether Moses actually realized that that was part of God's plan. Indeed, in the narrative so far, God hasn't even been mentioned. Moses seems to have taken it upon himself to be the people's redeemer. Well, why did Moses risk his place in the Egyptian court by killing this taskmaster? Well, we read in Hebrews that by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So he spent 40 years learning that he was important, and now he's blown it. He's used the gifts and skills, the background, the knowledge that God has given him, but in an inappropriate way. There is no indication that he sought to find God's will. In fact, when he killed the Egyptian, his only concern seems to be to check that no one else was looking. No indication of where's God in this. But his cover has been blown. I guess the Hebrew that he'd rescued from the thrashing must have gone back and told his family and friends, guess what happened to me today? An Egyptian ruler rescued me from punishment. So it kind of stayed secret for long. And the next day, Moses goes out again and sees two Hebrews fighting and tries to intervene. And instead of being seen as an instrument of justice, the people see Moses as a rash meddler with a violent temper. And they question, what right has he got to lord it over them? And of course, Pharaoh gets to hear about it, and Moses has to flee into exile and runs away to the land of Midian. We don't know exactly where Midian is. It's a long way from Egypt. But what we do know is it was the boondocks. His desire for justice is still there, and on the way he comes to the rescue of the women at the well. At least this time he doesn't commit murder. And he's taken into their family home by their father, Reuel. Or every other time in the Old Testament he's known as Jethro. And he's incorporated into their family and culture and marries Zipporah, one of his daughters. Moses is now living in the back of nowhere, where he'd spend his time looking after sheep for the next 40 years. He's clearly not happy there, and he gives his first son the name Gershon, saying, I've become an alien in a foreign land. So after 40 years in Egypt, thinking he was somebody, he now spends 40 years as a nobody. Moses' grand attempt at deliverance failed miserably so far. It has landed him as an 80-year-old fugitive, far from his people, and apparently powerless to rescue them. Where was God in all this? 400 years the people have been in Egypt, and now after 80 years after Moses' birth, he appears to have blown it. Well, on one level, God was working in Moses' life. At the start of the passage, Moses was a self-confident man in a position of privilege. And by the end, he's a nobody in the back of nowhere, looking after sheep. He learned humility the hard way. We read in the book of Numbers that Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. During that time in Midian, he learned humility. And over the next few weeks, we'll hear how Moses was a reluctant leader, called by God, unwilling to lead the people, and yet used as God's servant. But God was also working in Egypt and with the Hebrews. We read that Pharaoh had died. Maybe this caused the Jews to hope that things might get better with a change of government and a new leader. But they were wrong. Things only got worse. And it is then, for the first time, we read that they cried out to God. They groaned and they cried out for help. And we also read of God's response. God heard their cry. He remembered his promises. He looked on them and he saw. You know, sometimes deliverance takes a long time, but God saw and remembered. It's not as though God needed reminding, as though he needed a gentle nudge, a tap on the shoulder. Here, God, haven't you forgotten all about us? Wake up. God can't forget. Though it is written in the passage as though he had done, but he invites us back into his plans. It says more about the power of prayer and our involvement in God's purposes. Of course, these are human ways of speaking about God. He always hears. He always remembers, sees, and knows about his people. But it reminds us that he is aware of their troubles. He is concerned, and he's about to act on their behalf. The important phrase is that God remembered his covenant with Abraham, God's faithfulness to his promises. That's the basis for people's hope in all circumstances. So what can we learn from this? Firstly, God is in the business of using people who have failed. The Bible doesn't paper over the failures of its heroes. From being in the limelight of Pharaoh's government, Moses went into isolation and obscurity. His first attempt at leadership had been a dismal failure. He spent his first 40 years thinking he was somebody. He spent his second 40 years learning he was a nobody. And it was only after that that he spent his final 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. I've heard it said that life itself is not like school. In school, you get the lesson first, and then you get the exam later. In life, we often get the test first, and we learn the lesson from it. I've heard a story of a promising young executive in a company. He was involved in a risky financial venture that went wrong and resulted in the loss of millions of dollars. The CEO called him into his office, and the young man, rather sheepishly as he went in, said, "I guess you want my resignation." To which the CEO replied, "You can't be serious. We've just spent $1 million educating you. You'll learn from that mistake." God is in the business of using our failures if we are prepared to learn from them. Secondly, Moses had zeal without wisdom. Seeing the injustice of the Egyptian beating his poor Hebrew slave, it made him angry. And he rightly thought, this is wrong. But he acted on impulse. Moses' action reminds me, maybe, of when Peter pulled out his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane and cut off Malchus's ear. Do you know, somehow I suspect that Peter wasn't just aiming for his ear. Acting on impulse, even when it's based on right motivations, such as the desire for justice, acting on impulse is nearly always wrong. Let me give you a very trivial example I've had to learn from experience, is never send an angry email straight away. Leave it in the drafts box overnight. Review it in the morning when I've calmed down, and take most of it away before sending it. But also importantly, we remember that God does see what goes on, and he understands. God heard his people's groaning. That's not just a hearing, not just a listening, but a readiness to act, God's involvement. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not a mental kind of recollection, but the kind of remembering that inspires action. God looked on the Israelites with deep compassion, and he's concerned. We too are people who wait. We wait for God to act in a world that's filled with disaster and violence and injustice. We wait for God to transform us. Maybe we need to learn to cry out, to groan for the world in which we live, pleading with God to act in the world, not just for little old me, but for the big things out there, having confidence that God has his purposes and will fulfill them. Like the creation itself, we wait for God to transform us. We wait in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. God hears our groaning. God remembers his promises to us. He sees us and is concerned. Peter, writing in his second epistle, wrote, "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." So can we learn that God accepts people who fail and takes us again. And we learn to be people who cry out to God, who bring our nation and our international groaning to him, confident that he has his plans and he will act in his time. Amen.